Africa enters 2026 with record climate finance pledges, rapid growth in green bonds, and expanding ESG regulation. The key question is how this capital can be converted into bankable projects that deliver resilience, jobs, and inclusive growth. To unpack the risks, opportunities, and policy priorities shaping Africa's sustainability economy, we are joined by Edward Mungai, who is the CEO at Impact Africa Consulting. Edward, again, a very happy new year to you, and thank you very much for your time. So to just recap, we did see last year, Africa record, climate finance pledges rather, but it feels like a lot of that money is not hitting the ground. So from your perspective, what is really holding back impactful projects?
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. And I think, to your question about the impact, but actually before I get into that, it's important to put numbers into context. If we are going to survive, the question of climate change, the continent of Africa requires about $25 billion every year. Now, I must tell you, yes, there's many commitments that are adding up, hopefully to that 25 billion. But the truth of the matter is that only $6 billion is available on a yearly basis. So we still have a gap of close to $19 billion that we require if we were going to, to get back, as you were as a result of climate change. But to your question, yes, the $6 billion that is coming through, are we seeing impact onto the ground? The truth of the matter is that, we are not yet there. And the reason why we are not yet there is mainly because of how those resources have been allocated. 85% of those resources will go for what we call climate mitigation, whereas only about 15-20% is going for adaptation. Now, looking at the continent of Africa, what we truly need is how can we cope with the already changed climate, the effect of climate change. And that's the adaptation. And only very little is going into adaptation. So true to it is that what we need is adaptation. Unfortunately, less is going to adaptation. Most of it is going to mitigation. May it be solar, wind, and things like those. Yet, where we need money is in agriculture, is water resources, is health systems, is education systems. But we are not yet, seeing resources going into that. So it's a question of mismatch of where money is needed and where money is provided.
So who do you feel has the biggest role to play here when it comes to disbursing these funds and also these impactful projects? Is it the stakeholders, the government, investors? Who exactly should be taking the first initiative here?
Yeah. I think in terms of the commitment that you are seeing, which obviously is one part of the equation in terms of money coming from the global north, those commitments, I think there will be a bigger role, sits with government, and really government providing the right, legal frameworks and, regulatory frameworks that then would be able to channel the money. But actually, where we and the people who are responsible and who can, if we speak to them in the right language, is the private sector. I see that a lot of these 19, remember my gap of $19 billion, I think that can be more contributed by the private sector. Of course, the private sector is about making money, and now we are pushing them towards, doing good and making money. In that case, then we just need to convince them, and they just need also to go outside their, their status quo and probably be able to co-create projects that then would speak to the issues of climate change. So to answer your question, yes, government must create, proper frameworks, but also more critically is that private sector must also be engaged and must be able to have bankable project that then speaks to the gap that you're speaking to. And private sector do have a bigger role, as far as, bringing in the 19 billion that, that is missing.
So it is actually indeed a collective ecosystem that we are seeing here in terms of the players. On the same breath, let us speak into policies. We do have the government, but do we have the right policies in place? Do we understand some of these policies? And I'd like us to tie that question with the issue of green bonds and blended financing really taking off, and also how that is changing the way sustainability investments actually flow in African markets so far.
Yeah, true to it. I mean, I think the question that we should be asking ourselves, why is it that we, challenges in terms of getting financing, into the right places? May it be even green bonds? And true to it, we have seen growth in green bonds, but remember, those are just pockets. We find in South Africa, we find in Kenya, we find in, a little bit in Nigeria, but we want this movement to be all over the continent. But what is hindering that? And I think there's a couple of, couple of points that I think, if addressed, probably will enable not only green bonds, not only sustainable bonds, that will be able to mobilize more resources. And I think the first one is where we can be able to develop, bankable pipeline, bankable projects that then would be availed, to the private sectors who then would be able to put that to bear and probably be able to put money and for the money to flow. Because remember, the role of private sector is to make money, but we are challenging them and saying, make money as you do good. So pipeline will become a critical element, and that pipeline have been missing. The second thing that, is very important is the level of perceived risk. And I think we have to be real to ourselves. I think the perception of risk, have been, and especially for investors, have been, higher than the actual risk. So it is important that we reconcile the perceived versus the actual risk. And especially when it comes to green or climate investments, you need just, to have that technical knowledge, that technical capability to be able to educate our investors, the private sector, including governments, that they are not as risky as we might think that they are risky. It's also about the question about the capacity gaps that we've seen within the markets. For instance, you find Kenya, probably Rwanda, they are a bit progressive in terms of building the capacity of their people, when it comes to climate financing. Whereas in other markets, you find that there is still not yet the capacity in those countries. So for me, it is important that we deliberately build capacity of the African people, and especially those who are managing projects, investment managers, to be able to appreciate, where we are coming from when it comes to climate finance. And finally, is the technical capacity. Of course, there is the technical capacity to be able to build those bankable projects and be able to come up with financial models and include the things, the carbon credits into that. And eventually, if that is in place, then truly money will be able to flow not only from green bonds, but also from other vehicles, Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund, and other, vehicles will be able, to support the continent in terms of becoming more resilient when it comes to climate change.
Indeed, quite a lot to look forward to in that perspective. At the same time, we are seeing circular economy here, the initiatives and nature-based solutions are at the same time gaining so much traction. So where do you see the biggest opportunities for African businesses in 2026?
Yeah, I think a couple of areas where I see a lot of opportunity. First and foremost, and really, as you speak about in the circular economy, you speak about nature-based, AI and data, I think will become, critical elements to enable that process, to be able to know which section of that, ecosystem to be able to play in. Was, is it, proper production? Is it, recycling? Is it, reuse of some of these products? I think that would be very useful to use data and AI to be able to direct that. Of course, there's also the question about the hardcore technology, and the technologies that we'll be able to have. Of course, we have seen things like, carbon capture, becoming a key element within the continent of Africa, not relying, with the traditional carbon credits. Now we have technologies around carbon capture. We have better and efficient technologies within manufacturing, within the energy systems. I think that's also a critical area that, will be able to focus. Another trend that I see is a question around, decentralization, where traditionally, for instance, when it comes to power, we had, grid supplied power. Now we need to decentralize that, into localities. And that also have the benefit of reducing the emissions. It have the benefit of, people owning some of these systems and, engaging with them. So that decentralization becomes also a critical process. But I think more importantly, as we go into 2026, I think the fact that, companies can be able and private sector can be able to commit, and commit seriously in terms of seeing, sustainability or climate change not only as a good to have thing, but a must have thing. I think that will be able to make a difference. And we see more and more, stock exchanges within the continent of Africa, pushing the listed companies towards that. And once we push the listed companies, I do hope also unlisted companies also will be able to carry lessons because of the benefit they can be able to get by embedding, sustainability within themselves.
And in under a minute, Edward, I'd like you to speak into how African urban centers and innovators can strike the right balance for real impact from the net zero and resilience goals on the table right now.
Yeah, I think a couple of things there. One is that, in terms of urbanization, we must build smart cities or retrofit some of the cities that we've got, to become more sensible. It is about e-mobility systems. It could be about, how we are handling our waste. It could also be about how we are, of course, how we are transporting people and even how we are consuming and producing, within those cities. And I think government will help us to come up with the regulations, of course, practical regulations that then will be able to reward, but also at the same time be able to curtail those who are not aligning in terms of that smart city, kind of dimension. But I truly think that, most of the cities in the continent can be retrofitted. But as we build new cities, it's also important to think about net zero, commitments and how best we can be able to achieve that. And of course, we need to start seeing cities now, committing to net zero and saying, what kind of emissions they are looking at and putting systems in place on how to achieve those commitments.
Edward, quite a lot to be desired in that conversation. So thank you always for your insight.